I had two extremely weird things happen to me at the same time on a camping trip back in 1999. I've never experienced anything like it, and I've never even heard of anything like it happening to anyone else. I'm from Gig Harbor, Washington, and during the summer right before the year 2000, I went on a 5-day hiking and camping trip with two friends of mine, a guy and a girl who were a couple. For anyone who remembers the hype back then, we were jokingly taking a last vacation before the world was supposed to end. Really though, we were going to check out a place we had always wanted to see, the very remote Shi Shi Beach on the northwest tip of Washington. When we got up there, we hiked the 2-mile trail to get to the actual beach, then set up camp. My two friends put their tent back in the trees and off the sand, but I did the opposite. I wanted to be right out on the beach and in the open. I picked a spot on the sand that was semi-protected by driftwood, and my thought was if the weather cleared up, I'd be able to see the stars. After setting everything up, all we did was make food and walk around checking out tide pools. Later that evening, heavier clouds and a decent rain rolled in right as it was getting dark, so we decided to call it a night. I got into my tent with a book I'd brought with me and honestly was as happy as could be. I could hear the ocean along with the rain hitting my tent, and it was the perfect background noise for reading. About an hour later, it was dark and I was still reading by lantern light. Then, very abruptly, I heard the rain stop hitting my tent. It noticeably didn't taper off like you would think. It just stopped instantly. It was strange enough that I stuck my head out of the tent, half hoping the clouds had opened up, but I couldn't see anything but dark sky. I think I took that as my cue to go to sleep, so I put my flip-flops on and I walked out to go to the bathroom one more time before bed. Nobody else was camping around me, so I just walked toward the ocean and stood there. I don't think this is related to what I experienced, but that night the ocean had that faint glow to it from the bioluminescent algae. This is fairly common and something I had seen before, but the crashing waves had a very light blue-green glow stick color to them. It was beautiful and I had to stay out longer just to watch it. I walked closer to the water where I was maybe 50 feet from my tent and 50 from the surf, and almost like walking into a curtain, the rain hit me again and it was steady. I didn't want to go to bed wet, so I jogged back toward my tent, but in only a few steps the rain stopped again and it was a dead stop. This was very confusing at night and I didn't really know what was going on. I turned around and walked a few steps back toward the water again, but put both my arms out the second time. There was like an actual line where the rain would hit my hands but not my body. Then I could take a step back and it was totally dry. I stood there going back and forth because it made no sense. It's hard to put into words how weird this was. Because it was dark and hard to see, I had to run back to my tent to get my flashlight, mostly to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. On my way to get the flashlight, I noticed that the sand was pretty much dry between the spot where I was standing and my campsite. When I got back out toward the water with my light, I could shine it in front of me and actually see where the rain was coming down and where it wasn't. If I was facing my tent, there was nothing, no rain falling at all, but if I turned toward the water, I could see the rain coming down. It was almost like there was an invisible roof covering that part of the beach. I even walked around for a few minutes with the flashlight trying to figure out where the border of this phenomenon was at. Sure enough, I found it in 3 other places, all of which were around my campsite. As anyone would, I tried to think of how it could be happening, and eventually I figured it must be some kind of natural barrier where the forest might have been blocking part of the rain. After checking it out for a while longer, I ended up getting back into my tent and just going to sleep, only to have an even crazier experience the next morning. I woke up right before 6 a.m., and from what I could tell, the rain had stopped, or at least I thought it had. When I unzipped the tent and looked out, sure enough, I could still see it lightly raining over the ocean, but there wasn't any rain on my tent or the driftwood around me. It was exactly the same as the night before. Seeing it in the light that morning made me pretty sure it was natural, and it had to have something to do with the way that specific beach was shaped and how the weather was hitting it. Then I just so happened to look south, down the line where the forest meets the sand, and sitting right at the edge of the trees, no more than 30 feet from my tent, was a black bear. It wasn't a huge one, but seeing it made me go from sleepy and groggy to wide awake in an instant. It was sitting on its back legs just like a dog would sit and staring straight up above us at the sky. I obviously froze up because it was a bear, but also because it was looking straight up and not moving. I have seen bears before and even chased one out of a campsite in Northern California once, but I had never seen one do anything like that. I remember thinking it almost looked fake or like a statue. For a few seconds I watched it and tried to figure out what I wanted to do. I decided I was going to scare it off by yelling and banging my flashlight against my metal cooking pot, so without spending much time thinking about it, I got out of the tent, stood up to seem bigger, and started banging and yelling. The bear turned its head and locked eyes with me, but then it just took off into the trees. The second it was gone, I ran up to my friend's tent while still banging the pot and woke them up. I told them I had just scared a bear out of our camp, which also made them get up quickly. Once they were dressed and out of the tent, we all made coffee and I told them about how the bear was sitting near my tent and staring at the sky, as well as what had happened with the rain and how it had been like an invisible roof over me all night long. They didn't really know what to make of it either. While we drank our coffee, I walked them both down to my tent to show them what I was talking about, and even then the sand around the whole area was completely dry compared to everywhere else along the beach. In the daytime, all three of us could easily see the outline of a roughly 100-foot patch around where I was camped. Everyone thought it was incredibly strange, but again, we all figured it had to be natural, and after that morning we pretty much moved on with our trip. Later that morning, the clouds burned off and the day turned out to be beautiful. We didn't get any more rain for the rest of the trip. We had a great time and I really didn't think much more about what happened until we were driving back to Gig Harbor. The true weirdness of it hit me while I was spacing off and looking out the window in the back seat. I kept thinking about how the rain had just stopped hitting my tent that first night after a full hour of it coming down normally. It was just so sudden, like something had moved in and started blocking it. Then I wondered how it stayed that way all night over the same small area. On top of that, and what now makes me believe it was not natural, was the black bear sitting at the edge of the dry patch in the morning. The last time I checked, bears don't casually sit on their back legs and stare at the sky for long periods of time. That was not normal. I believe something was above us that whole night. I never actually saw anything, but I think something was there. There had to have been a solid object blocking the rain, and maybe because bears have better eyesight than we do, it could see subtle things that I couldn't, and that's why it was staring up like that. I have this gut feeling that the bear was actually looking at something and not just sitting there mindlessly staring. Whatever it was, I think of that trip and all the weird details every time I hear the rain, and living in the Pacific Northwest, that happens quite often. Something happened to my brother that was so weird it's hard for me to even talk about. I'm going to call him Tim because we live in a small town. I'll never say I know for sure what it was, but I have suspicions, and I go back and forth in my head about what actually happened. What I do know is that he was one person before it happened, then he was a different person afterward. We live in Crested Butte, Colorado, and if you've heard of the town, you might know it's a paradise for mountain biking. People come from all over the country to ride here, and for Tim, it was heaven. He's always been an avid cyclist and the kind of guy who plans most things around riding. This all started on my son's birthday when we were having a party and barbecue at our house. Everyone was showing up around 3, then food was at 5. After that, it would just go as long as people wanted to hang out. A few of our son's friends and their parents were coming, as well as some of our family, including Tim. I had talked to him that morning and he was going on a ride before the party, which wasn't unusual at all. He was doing a trail he'd done 100 times and I knew he'd probably show up still in his biking gear to eat and hang out for the rest of the night. Also that day he happened to be riding alone, but again that was completely normal. The party started at 3 and about 30 minutes into it I realized Tim wasn't there yet, so I sent him a text to check in. It wasn't much, just a quick "Hey, are you on your way?" but he didn't text me back. I figured either his phone had died or maybe he had an issue with his bike and was still making his way back. By 5 o'clock, when we were starting the barbecue and getting into dinner, I still hadn't heard a word, so I called his phone and it went straight to voicemail. That was the moment I started to feel the little knot of worry in my stomach. My husband was assuring me Tim was fine, saying he most likely had something break on his bike and was walking out, but I was starting to think he had crashed or was hurt somewhere. By 7 o'clock, I was more than uneasy. I told my husband that if we didn't hear from him soon, we would need to either call the police or head out to the trailhead ourselves to at least see if his car was there. This was so not like him. By that time, most people were leaving the party and I was trying to clean up while checking my phone every 2 minutes. Finally, around 7:30, my phone rang and it was Tim. I immediately asked what happened and he told me he had taken a fall on his bike. He didn't remember much about it, but thought he must have been knocked unconscious because he woke up off trail and at the bottom of a hill on the other side of a banked turn, which would have made it hard for other bikers to even see him. He told me he wasn't injured and felt fine and was really downplaying the whole accident. I did make him promise me that he would get checked out no matter what, and he told me he would, but I still only half believed him. I was honestly just happy to hear his voice. The next day, I stopped by his house after grocery shopping because I wanted to see him in person and check on how he was doing. As soon as he opened the door, I noticed something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but he didn't seem like himself. We sat in his living room together and I got more details about what happened. He explained that he'd been coming down a section that was mostly downhill with only a short distance left to his car, and literally the only memory he had after that was waking up on the ground at the bottom of the hill and it was almost dark. He said he checked himself over, especially his head, and everything seemed fine, so he just got back on his bike and barely made it to his car before it was completely dark. Here's the thing though, I was looking closely at him the whole time we were talking, and there wasn't a mark on him. No scrapes or bruises or scratches, and he told me he wasn't even sore. His helmet and bike were sitting right inside of his front door, and both looked fine when I walked in. If he had gone down hard enough to knock himself out, he should have been banged up at least a little bit, but he was spotless and that really concerned me. There's also the fact that he had never, not once, missed one of my son's birthdays. It wasn't like him to make an excuse or skip out. That's not Tim. So the more I thought about it, the more his story sounded like some kind of cover-up for something else. Sometime later that week, I called him. This was just a random, normal call in my free time because we talk all the time. We were on the phone for about a half hour, and during the call, I noticed something else that was not at all like him. He kept using words and phrases that he had never used in his life. Don't get me wrong, he's a smart guy, but he's not the type to correct someone else's grammar, and that night he kept correcting me on the littlest things, like saying fewer instead of less and things like that. And when I asked him why he kept doing that, he apologized for being pedantic. Pedantic was not a word Tim has ever or would ever use. If I had asked him to define it right there on the spot, he wouldn't have been able to. That made me seriously start questioning whether he was okay or not. Then the first big red flag happened. That following weekend, we went out with Tim and some of our other friends to Irwin Brewing, which is a little pub in town. Everything seemed fine until our food came out. Tim ordered a burger, which was totally normal, but when it arrived, it had big pickle slices on it that I could actually see when they set his plate down. Tim absolutely hated pickles. He had hated them since we were kids and used to complain even if a pickle wedge touched his sandwiches, but this time he just picked up the burger and took a huge bite, pickles and all. I looked at him like he was crazy after his first bite and asked if he was really going to eat that. He just looked at me and said, "Yeah, why wouldn't I?" And then he just shrugged his shoulders at me as if to say, "So what?" and then ate the whole burger. I know this might sound trivial, but it was one of the weirdest things I've ever seen him do. After that night, there was a second red flag, and it was one that made me say something. The final straw came when he stopped by my house to drop off his contribution to our dad's birthday package. Our dog Major has always been in love with Tim. He would run to him with his tail wagging and jump up on him while Tim would act like an excited child. But this time, Major just froze and stared like he didn't want to go near him, and Tim barely even acknowledged it. This was a huge noticeable change in Tim and in our dog, and that's when I had to say something. I asked Tim point blank what was going on. I brought up everything I had noticed and told him I knew something wasn't right, and then I asked him to please be honest with me. He stood there and looked at me with this defeated look, then sat down on our couch and asked me to sit too. My first thought was, oh God, he's got cancer or something serious like that. But what he actually said was so unexpected, and it totally blindsided me. Right off the bat, he told me he hadn't fallen on his bike, then told me to brace myself. He said that while he was riding that upper part of the trail, he saw something in the trees that was making a noise he couldn't describe, but it was one he could actually feel in his handlebars as he was getting closer to it. When he came around the corner, he got a better view, and it was on the other side of a section of trees in an open area. He dropped his bike at the corner and walked toward it, and right there in the open patch was this thing that, in his words, looked exactly like a small lenticular cloud hovering no more than 20 feet off the ground. Apparently, it was about the length of a semi-truck, and it was actually curling in on itself around the edges like a smoke ring would, but it was thick and he couldn't see through any part of it. Completely in shock by what he was seeing, he was only able to take a step or two back before feeling something wrap around him like a blanket. He said he started to get tunnel vision, and then there was nothing. That's when he came to at the bottom of the hill next to his bike. Since it was nearly dark out at that point, he knew he'd been out there for hours. His reason for not telling me was because it sounded so unbelievable, and that's why he had made up the bike crash story. He said he really didn't even know what to say about it. We talked there for another hour that night, and I told him over and over that I believed him with all my heart. Tim's entire life had been about the outdoors and adrenaline and the next adventure. If you knew him, you'd understand how something so unbelievable and incredible would never come out of his mouth unless it was the absolute truth. He also admitted feeling very different since it happened. It was like he knew he was acting and feeling differently and could actually see it happening in the moment, but felt like he couldn't control the things he was doing. He did tell me that it was starting to go away though, and maybe it was just the pure shock of what happened wearing off. He then asked me very seriously to please keep it between us. He didn't want to talk about what happened and definitely didn't want anyone questioning him or treating him differently, so I have always honored that request. I did get his permission to submit the story with the names changed though. I'm so glad he was okay with it because it's been hard for me not to talk about this with anyone. I'll finish by saying this. When you hear a story like this from someone you trust more than any other human being on Earth, someone you've known since birth, your actual blood relative, you know for a fact and to your core that it's true. And that's why this has changed everything for me as much as it has for Tim. In 2011, I saw something that could only be a non-human ship. I served as a Marine air traffic control radio technician where my duties were radio setup and repairs. I was stationed at a forward operating base, or what is called an FOB, to set up and control airspace. Specifically, this was FOB Ramrod, also known as Forward Operating Base Sarkari Karez, which was located in the Maiwand district, Kandahar province, Afghanistan. I have plenty of crazy stories about my time there, but this was on a whole other level. Back then, I felt like I had a very solid knowledge and understanding when it came to military aircraft. With very good accuracy, we could recognize helicopter types just by sound. It always seemed to me that you could hear farther in the desert than anywhere else, too. At the time, there was also a drone team there teaching the Army how to fly mid-sized drones. I had occasionally flown the smaller drones, but these larger drones were a much bigger deal. Even during the daytime, with all the noise from the base, you could still hear the hum of them when they were several hundred feet off the ground. I worked 12-hour shifts every day, and on this night, at the end of my shift, I was walking back to my can for sleep with full flak Kevlar 180 rounds in my rifle. While walking back, I started to get an incredibly weird feeling that came out of nowhere. I have no idea why, but I had an overwhelming feeling to look up. As soon as I did, I could see that there was something above me. I could barely make out the shape of it because it was nighttime and the object was dark, but it was moving at the same slow walking speed that I was. From my perspective, it looked fairly large and it seemed to be blocking out the stars, or at least making them hard to see. It almost looked like it was fading in and out of being translucent, if that makes sense. I also want to mention that it was not that high up. If you had a good arm, I would say it was within throwing distance. I finally stopped walking to see what this thing was, and I got a little concerned because it stopped moving forward just seconds after I did. This was when I got a pretty clear look at it. To me, it looked like a perfectly equal black triangle, and I would guess each side of it had to be at least 60 feet long. I have heard stories of people seeing black triangle-shaped aircraft with bright lights underneath, but this was not like that. It did have 2 rows of barely visible circles on its belly, but I want to say they were there for propulsion because the longer I stared at them, the more I could see a very faint red coming out from the edges of each circle. I almost want to say they were emitting light outside or on the edge of our visible spectrum. I remember standing there completely speechless, and the next thing I really focused on was how the entire body of it had some kind of stealth camouflage going on. It was literally blending itself into the stars behind it, and it reminded me of the active camouflage from Halo, but I could still see it kind of coming and going. I couldn't tell you how long I was looking at this, but it had to be several minutes. I could hear my own voice in my mind saying it didn't exist. Then I would ask myself if I was seeing this or just confused. For someone with a lot of experience around aircraft, I had absolutely no idea what I was looking at. I actually started going down a mental checklist. Was I dreaming? No. Could I be hallucinating? I don't think so. Was I so tired from my shift that I was having some kind of sleep-deprived vision? Also, no. My very next thought was that I should aim at it with my rifle and be prepared to shoot if I needed to. Then, almost as if it knew what I was thinking, it took off at an incredible speed in the opposite direction of the base and then straight up into the sky. It had to have broken the sound barrier with how fast it went, but I didn't hear a sonic boom. I will also say that it wasn't silent though. It did have a sound that I would describe as a low hum mixed with a high-pitched ringing. It was much quieter than even the tiniest drones we would fly on the base, and I am certain it moved with more G-force than any living thing could handle, so I'm guessing that it was being piloted remotely. I watched it for as long as my eyes could keep track of it, then I lost it and it was gone. The only thing I was left with was a powerful gust of wind. I actually felt the air displace from it taking off like it did, and that was a wild feeling because it confirmed I wasn't nuts. I barely slept that night, obviously, and it had my blood flowing for hours after it happened. I went back and forth about reporting it, but I had heard of people being kicked out for speaking about anything like this, so I never reported a thing. Actually, I kept my mouth shut about it for years. There were a few times where I desperately wanted to tell someone and talk about it, but I could never bring myself to actually say it out loud. I ended up keeping it to myself for a long time, but I did eventually tell a few close people in my life and talk about it. I really do think about it almost every day, even this many years after it happened. It'll just pop into my mind and I can see it all over again, and very vividly. I still wonder why it was above me though. Why was it moving perfectly along with me at that walking speed and then stop when I stopped? I absolutely feel like I was being watched for some reason. I guess the big mystery for me is, who was watching?